Hello, and welcome to this lecture entitled Description. We'll cover three main topics, that is, components of an integrated descriptive system. First, we'll talk about the purpose of description. Then we'll talk about the finding aid, which is the chief source of information for the collection. Then we'll talk about both descriptive standards and catalog records. What is the purpose of description? First, it's to communicate information about groups of records to their potential users. These users might be internal users, staff members, or they might be external users, that is, researchers. They establish administrative control over collections, and description establishes intellectual control over collections. Some of the administrative tools you use include internal tools like the appraisal, accession, and condition documents that you as a student have already encountered. Sometimes they include creator-supplied inventories like box lists or file keys from the donor. Other times they include preliminary inventories like your record surveys and your arrangement plans. Another kind of tool is external tools. These are guides and specialized descriptions. They're published for public consumption. They cover specific themes. They might be, for example, LibGuides. Librarians put LibGuides together to assist students in finding things by subject. Archivists do similar things. Archivists also make union lists, that is, topically based finding aids or at least notices of collections gathered together in one place. The most comprehensive and probably the most important union list of manuscript collections is named exactly that, the National Union List of Manuscript Collections, called NUCMUC, and formerly maintained by the Library of Congress. Another external tool is the finding aid. Finding aids are collection specific. Then there are catalog records. This provides access to the finding aid that provides access to the collection itself. Let's talk now about finding aids as chief sources of information for archival collections. A finding aid, first of all, is a document. It tells a story describing the context of creation of the collection and describes the arrangement that you have either imposed or distilled for that collection. The document, the finding aid, is composed of elements, that is, fields, and content, that is, data, in each of the fields. They come in different formats. The most common that you'll encounter is first the hard copy format that you'll get in a file at an archives. Then you can encounter web-based finding aids. Sometimes they look a little different from the hard copy aids, but that's fine. And then many finding aids are data-based. Remember when we talked about the 5 different levels of arrangement? Well, not only can you arrange in 5 different levels, but the real purpose of arranging in those levels is so you can describe in those levels. DAX, which we'll talk about in a second, a content standard for archival description, talks about top-level description and subsequent level description. To make this clear, I wanted to show and discuss this graphic that you see before you. When you're speaking about a finding aid and the levels of description, you're first talking about description at the collection level, the entirety of the collection. What fields apply to the collection? Generally speaking, the first subsequent level, and it has a couple of other fields that you add to it, are the series levels. In a very complicated collection, you might have subgroups. That falls between the collection and the series on this particular chart. You might even have subseries. That would fall between the series and the files in this particular chart. But generally speaking, all of your collections, when you describe them, will fall into this schema. The top level is the collection. The first subsequent level is the series, and the second subsequent level is the file. Let's look at 7 descriptive elements from DAX. DAX is a content standard describing archives, a content standard second edition manual published by the Society of American Archivists in 2013. The elements are before you here. Identity elements, content and structural elements, we'll talk about these, access and use elements, acquisition and appraisal elements. All of those are included in every finding aid. Now, DAX talks about minimal level finding aids, optimum level finding aids, and added value finding aids, at least elements within finding aids. So you see that the identity elements, the content and structural elements, the access and use elements, the acquisition and appraisal elements all belong in the minimal or optimal finding aid. The related material elements, the notes elements, and description control elements are all in the added value finding aids. Not every finding aid contains all of these elements. Let's break these elements down into their component parts. Identity elements include all of these in a minimal level finding aid, and then you can see at the bottom here the biohist sketch is in the optimum level finding aid. Let's talk about these for a moment. The first thing that your finding aid should include is repository information. This can be as simple as a one-line statement listing the name of the repository, or it can be more complicated in which you provide contact information, hours of operation, things like that for the repository. Assign a reference code to the collection itself. Include the creator's names. Remember, provenance demands that we pay attention to the creator. Include a title that might be the words records for records of an organization, papers for the historical manuscripts of a person, or collection for bodies of materials brought together but not necessarily produced by the particular creator. Include a date span. And frequently, you'll find the creator's names, the title, and the date span listed as a single element. For example, the Terry Everett Congressional Records, that's the creator name and the title, 1993 to 2012. That's the date span. But it's all included in one long title-like statement. Include the size or the extent of the collection in its own separate element. And for an optimum level finding aid, remember to include a biographical, historical, or administrative statement, which we frequently refer to as the biohist note. You can find this in DAX, which you've been provided, under section 2.7, pages 33 to 44. Content and structural element statements include a scope and content statement, which archivists call the scope note. That talks about what functions it documents, what organizational components it documents, and what kinds of materials generally described that you'll find in the collection itself. There's also an organization and arrangement statement. Organization refers to the subcomponents of the collection. For example, this collection is organized into X number of series, or the collection is organized into Y number of subgroups. Subgroup 1, give it a title, contains X number of series, and you give them titles. Then there is an arrangement statement. Arrangement does not refer to the collection, it refers to the files in the boxes. So how are those files arranged? The collection is organized often into series. The files are arranged. Remember that one of the earmarks of a series is the file arrangement. Might be reverse chronological order for letters, alphabetical for research or reference files. Let's move on now to access and use elements. Who can see the collection is what the access element addresses. State that the collection is open for access and what authorizes such access. For example, you might say collection is open per gift agreement, or it's open consists of public records. There sometimes are restrictions that certain materials cannot be open for 75 years, for example, or for 25 years, please don't use that kind of statement. Do the math and figure out at least what year that collection can be open and available for access. Remembering that archivists want immediate access, and sometimes donors or the law want restricted access. More frequently than not, though, you'll find restrictions under use. Use is something different than access. Access means you get to see it. Use means, can you make copies of it or can you publish it somewhere? Reprinting might be restricted. Frequently, either the archivist or the donor has to give permission to reprint. Sometimes that's abrogated. If your donor allows you to put something up onto the web, remember that that's such a low resolution copy that no one can actually make any money off of it by republishing it. You should understand, and you should communicate to your donors, that if they allow you to put something onto the web, people will take it and they will use it on their own websites, or they might publish it like a kid publishing it on a paper in private communications. But that's not really what we mean here. If a donor or you as the archivist does not want this to happen, then you have to restrict publication from the web as well. Donors sometimes give permission, sometimes the archivist gives permission, and you can create a statement saying any reprint beyond fair use quotation, which is about 100 words, must be permitted by the donor, or archivist permission required to reprint, or something to that effect. Other elements in a good finding aid are acquisition and appraisal elements. You see here the custodial history, often referred to as a provenance note. The immediate source of acquisition, which might be as simple as a person's name or an organizational name, but frequently contains all kinds of contact information, which is particularly necessary if you have some kind of use or access restriction that can be overridden by express permission. The acquisition and appraisal elements should have an appraisal statement. Archivists are really bad at doing this. We don't really ever express why we have brought something in or how it fits into our collecting policy. But it's really a good idea to put in an appraisal statement. And it simply answers the question, why, according to your repository's policies, was this collection accepted? Where does it fit in the policy? Or if it doesn't fit in the policy, why did you take it? Then there should be a note concerning additions. That is, additions are also referred to as accruals. They come in at different times. You put them through the accession process, and often we just simply call them accessions. But accrual means additions to the collection. Even a collection that you believe is completely static, the collection of some closed office or some defunct business or organization may get accruals to it as closets get cleaned out or attics get cleaned out, or people who are associated with the organization or the individual are found to have somehow acquired records of the place, and those things come to you. So generally you can't say we expect more accruals, but you go back to your original finding aid and note that there are other accruals that come through. For added value finding aids, there are related materials elements, that is, where are the locations of originals or where are the locations of copies, plus a statement about what publications have been made from the collection itself. Is it a book that heavily used the collection? Make a note about that under related materials. Is there a website that publishes a part of a collection? Then make a note about that under related materials. Another one of these added value elements is a general notes element. This allows for commentary that doesn't fit any other field. You can describe what conservation measures you've taken, X or Y document was repaired. You can talk about electronic access information here, and you can add a preferred citation note. What do you really want someone writing when they make a footnote citation about this particular collection? And there are descriptive control elements. Where are your sources of information for the biographical statement? Do you have a bibliography that you need to associate with this collection? Is there a statement about what body of rules guided the finding aid makers? For example, did you use DAX for the language that you used in your biographical historical sketch? All of that can be put under descriptive control elements. Most archivists don't use these elements, but those that are trained by library catalogers do. Let's talk now about standards for description and catalog records. First of all, let's talk about vocabulary. I'm going to give you a definition for each of these words that you see before you now. Metadata. I'll just throw out the word metadata once in a while, so you need to know what it is. Metadata is data about data. It is used to locate or manage information resources by abstracting those resources or by capturing information not inherent in the resource. Now, this is basically what a finding aid is, or what a catalog record is. It's a distillation, an abstract, a description of the actual resource, which is the collection itself. So finding aid and catalog records lumped together, we call them metadata. Another word that I might just flip around here, and I want you to understand what it is the phrase technical standards. These are explicit definitions not subject to unilateral change that yield consistent results. Technical standards are when I criticize you for not putting your commas in the right place or using periods instead of commas in your footnote citations. Those footnote citations have technical standards, and you have not learned or followed them, particularly for catalog records, because so many of them are machine readable. There are technical standards. There are also technical standards in what we call controlled vocabulary that we'll talk about in a minute. These include things like types of punctuation, spacing, stuff like that. Professional standards, that is, rules, are protocols accepted formally by professional associations. So they're not so much technical standards as they are fairly strict, agreed upon protocols for doing a task or behaving a particular way. Less restrictive are guidelines. These are commonly agreed upon and shared approaches rather than formally ratified professional standards. And then there are best practices. Best practices often are evolving. That is, this is how we do it, how we've agreed upon doing something, a set of tasks or set of behaviors to the best of our ability as we understand it right now. They're informal or semi-formal approaches, usually communicated through articles in the professional literature or through workshops or through conference papers. Okay, now that you know a little bit of this vocabulary, then let's talk about standards of description. Now, there are different kinds of standards. There are structural standards and content standards. And then there's controlled vocabulary. So let's talk about these. Structural standards. What fields do you use in a catalog record? For our finding aids, DAX, Describing Archives, a Content Standards, second edition, we often refer to it as DAX 2, sets up both the structural standards, those elements that you have to include, and it's a content standard. What kind of language do you use in each of those fields to prepare the content for those fields? When you get to catalog records, there are different structural standards. Structural standard is defined as what data elements are contained in the information system or the catalog record. That is the fields you need to include in the catalog record. They're different for different kinds of catalog records, but frequently they are what we call crosswalked. You can make a comparison. for example, between these three that you see here. Machine Readable Catalog, MARC, M-A-R-C 21, is a structural standard for archival collections and books that you see in an online library catalog. When you go to the Troy University catalog, when you go to a different university catalog, when you go to WorldCat, produced by OCLC, a union list of MARC records that libraries, academic libraries in particular, report their holdings to. When we buy a book at Troy University, we report that we have bought this book by filling out one of these MARC 21 records. MARC 21 was established by the Library of Congress and is maintained by the Library of Congress with the ability to alter the rules in the tag library. And it has machine readable tags. It's based on the old DOS system, operating system that came out in the 1980s and 1990s. And it has numbered fields for various elements. This is not eye-readable. When you look at a catalog record for a book or an archival collection that's been written into a library catalog, you might see something that says author, and then it might have a person's name next to it. Well, when the cataloger is filling that out, that field doesn't say author. It says 100. Or if it's a business, 110. If it's a conference that's put out receivings, 111. Yeah, I know this stuff. It's embarrassing. Anyway, the title has a different number. It's a 245 field. But this is based on an old operating system that's never quite changed. And it's maintained again by Library of Congress. There are all kinds of authorities out there that can help you get started in this kind of cataloging. And in fact, technical services librarians are educated in how to make machine readable catalog records work. Think about this. The OCLC database, based on MARC 21 records, has millions and millions and millions of records inside of it. To make all of those records equally searchable, those fields have to be the same, and the machine has to be able to search and return a search based on those millions and millions and millions of records and those few fields with triple-digit numbers. Another catalog record with a slightly different body of elements is the Dublin Core. This too was established by OCLC, and it's meant to be a string of HTML or XML code that has identity elements in it: title, name of creator, a biographical sketch, a content sketch, that you can generate online, copy the text, paste it into an HTML record that is searchable by specialized or general search engines like Google. Dublin Core, which is what I've asked you to use to set up your metadata record for your finding aid, is to catalog electronic media by placing searchable fields in the header. So it's right there with your finding aid. Archivists built a standard for their structure for finding aids in the 1990s. It's called Encoded Archival Description. It's an XML compliant language with hierarchical fields that are repeatable at all levels of the arrangement. The top level, the first, second, and third subsequent levels, and fourth and fifth and sixth subsequent levels if you go that far. These are tags in XML for searchable fields to allow one-pass creation of web-capable finding aids. Let's look now at, since you're thoroughly confused by these structural standards, let's look now at content standards. Content standards are really the rules that govern the actual information in each of the structural fields or elements. This is, how do you write good input per field? Some of the authorities for these content standards, how you write good input per field, are Describing Archives, a Content Standard Second Edition, which we call DAX 2. You can use that information to write your Dublin Core records. In Canada, and now moving down into the United States, is a content standard called Rules for Archival Description, RAD. It's a Canadian standard. And then there are specialized content standard manuals that tell you how to think about what goes into the particular element fields with specialized material. For example, oral histories have their own cataloging manual. So how do you write good catalog records? What language goes in there to make them robust and well searchable? Describing Archives, a content standard, makes a good Dublin Core record. Let's look now at controlled vocabulary. Are you tired of searching by keywords? You make up keywords and then you try to figure out from the millions of hits which ones you want, and I guarantee you that the ones you actually want are not in the first 5 pages of what Google returns. So we use controlled vocabulary for much more powerful professional level searching. It gives us robust returns without a bunch of noise. These are the actual words you use as content for particular fields. They may include grammatical structure as well, and the first of these that I have listed here does indeed include grammatical structure. Library of Congress subject headings. You have used these, I hope, when you've conducted research for your history classes. In each catalog record for a library book, there should be something called a descriptor. These use Library of Congress subject headings. If they're names that are subjects, they're the 600, 610, 611 field. If they are topics, they're the 650 field. If they're geographical, they're 651s. 600 level fields are the most interesting. That is the general subject heading. And let's see how a controlled vocabulary works. That little problem with Hitler's Germany that occurred in, say, the 1930s and 40s, what is that called? Yes, you know right now that it's World War II. Or is it the Second World War? You know, the Russians call it the Great Patriotic War. So what if you wanted to bring together all of the books that a particular library had on this conflict? The Library of Congress, because it deals with international books, chose to use a very specific phrase, World War, comma, space, 1939, space, hyphen, space, 1945, period. That can be subdivided, and if you look at the Library of Congress subject headings, which you have access to in your library, maybe not your local library, but in an academic library, the catalogers may have 4 big fat books, but they also have access to the online database now that Library of Congress uses for their subject headings. You can look at this and you can see that there are hundreds of pages devoted to the subcategories under World War, comma, space, 1939, space, dash, space, 1945, period. There are also authority records. These may be produced by Library of Congress or they may be produced locally. This is again a controlled vocabulary. It is the agreed upon actual wording of what the subjects are. Authority records are usually for personal names. Personal names often include structural standards like last name first, comma, space, first name, and they may even include dates if the person's name might be relatively common, or if you want to make sure you're identifying a very specific individual, you might see, for example, my name is listed as Olliff, comma, space, Martin, T, period, comma, space, 1955, dash. That's my specific authority record for my name in the Library of Congress subject headings. Then there are specialized thesauri. For example, the Art and Architecture Thesaurus has page after page of words that describe components of architecture and of art and techniques of art, so that if you are creating either a finding aid or a catalog record, you will have a body of language to use when you describe how that roof looks. If you're dealing with artifacts, then there is the nomenclatura, or the nomenclature for artifacts for use by museums. Okay, with this said, your task is to build a finding aid that describes the context of creation and your arrangement schema for your collection. Your finding aid should use DAX for its structure and its content. The finding aid should describe the top level, that is the collection, and all subsequent levels, series, containers, items, as appropriate. You are also to write a Dublin Core record. Fill out the correct fields using DAX as the content standard. Generate an HTML encoded Dublin Core record and then copy and paste it into a document, and please make it iReadable. Thank you very much. This ends the lecture, and as always, I appreciate your time.